Hello and welcome to Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social democratic alternative for the politically homeless. I'm hilary.salt.
And I'm Sebastian Moore.
And today, as you can see from our background, we have an extra special episode celebrating St George's Day, 23rd of April. And we have a fantastic guest with us. We want to mark St George's Day by talking about the nation, the concept of nations. And so we're joined by Professor Peter Ramsay. Hi, Peter.
Hi. Hi, Hilary. Hi, Sebastian.
Fantastic of you to join us. You sent me a very long bio, Pete, so I'll just maybe pick out a few little edited highlights if you don't mind. So I know that you specialise in the theory of crime and of punishment, and that you're the founder member of the Full Brexit, which was a kind of pro-Brexit group of academics. You didn't find many pro-Brexit academics, did you, back in the day?
There were really not very many pro-Brexit academics.
And you're also the author
of the London School of Economics. Well, funnily enough, in my
Yes.
department, in the law school, there were several of us, which is but highly unusual.
Yeah.
Place in the LSE where there were
Yeah.
pro-Brexit people.
And I know you're also the co-author of Taking Control, Sovereignty and Democracy After Brexit, which we will add in the show notes so that people can look that book up.
Firstly, I'll apologise because I wanted to... There we go. Perfect. So we'll cut to that. But I looked for it at home because I thought, I'll bring it and then I can hold it up to the camera. But I realised I've lent it to my dad. So don't have it to hand. But it was I thoroughly recommend it for anybody that wants to understand a much more academic and intellectual case for Brexit. It was really eye-opening for me, and I actually attended a talk that you gave, Peter, as you'll know, a couple of years ago, and you were the person to tell me about the STP. So I have you to thank.
Oh, we have Pete to thank.
Maybe.
I'm glad to be of assistance.
And finally, I should also mention the Northern Star online, your blog, named after the newspaper of the Chartists, isn't it?
Yes.
And some great articles on there for people to catch up on. We'll put all this in the show notes. So we are, as I said, celebrating St George's Day by talking a little bit about the nation. So I don't know, do you generally celebrate St George's Day, Pete?
No, not really. To be honest, no. I mean, I'm happy that people do, but it doesn't quite. It's never quite. Although I'm an Anglican in origin, not anymore. I'm lapsed, but no, it doesn't quite connect with me. I mean, I can.
Yeah.
I feel like we're missing on St George's Day. We're missing that thing. Like on St Patrick's Day, you'd have a Guinness.
Mm-hmm.
Right, what do we have on St George's Day? Like a pie.
Yeah.
A pie. A beer. Pint of beer.
Beer.
Yeah.
Or indeed, in the town where I live, on St Patrick's Day, there'll be an Irish music session. And people all go down there, and so the Irish do their thing. But yes, we don't have the equivalent. It's true.
Yeah. I don't think I particularly celebrate it, but I do get very annoyed with all the people who start talking about how he was Turkish or all those things about, he was never British,
Yeah.
So
we know.
Two disclaimers. Firstly, you'll notice that we've also got the Union flag on our cups down here because we're really taking the opportunity, because it's St George's Day. We thought we'll talk about England, but more broadly the United Kingdom. So we're sort of representing both. And the second disclaimer is that flag is incredibly creased. That's because I mistakenly took it to my Irish friend's house for the England-Ireland rugby match in the Six Nations this year, and he decided to screw it up and tie it into a ball. So,
Shocking.
Yeah, there we go.
Anyway, so I guess one of the reasons maybe we don't celebrate the same way that other nations might do is that kind of Englishness and Britishness is quite problematic these days, isn't it? Why is that? Why do we have a problem with our nation?
Do we? My answer would be that our state has a problem with our nation. I think the majority of the population don't, for now. But the British state has a problem with the nation, and the people who inhabit it, and the people who educate it. The officials, the civil servants, the academics, the leaders of the professions. Yes, the British elite has a problem with the British nation, and that's because it's a very cosmopolitan elite. It relates to the outside world. It bluntly, as we're seeing, serves foreign capital by and large. We have a political economy which has been heavily sold off, which is heavily internationalized, is dependent, globalized, is dependent on world markets, and as a consequence, we have a political elite and an intellectual elite that is itself genuinely cosmopolitan. It relates to the outside world. I mean, to tell you a story from the LSE, one of my colleagues in the law school proposed some years ago. You may know that university campuses in British universities have campuses in like Dubai or Shanghai or China. So you can go to the University of Nottingham in some Chinese city, and the same in the Middle East. So he proposed, how about an LSE North, a London School of Economics and we were thinking of Darlington or Gateshead or somewhere on the train, so that people could go back and forth, and which would emphasise the LSE as a British institution and not just a London and kind of global institution. And of course, the proposal, he wrote the proposal, we knew it was going nowhere. We put it to one of the bodies, and it went nowhere. And that sort of indicates the problem, that our institutions like that are global institutions. They're not British institutions, because the people who inhabit them don't see themselves. They have no skin in the national game.
So when did you start thinking about the nation?
Yeah, that's it came through. When do you start thinking about the nation? I suppose coming from the left politically, from a long time ago, I was always a bit suspicious of the British nation, and that's and of course the famous George Orwell quote about the English intellectuals being embarrassed. One thing they were super embarrassed about was being English, and they'd be more ashamed of taking the money from the poor box, and so they'd be less ashamed of taking money from the poor box than they would of admitting to their Englishness. That, I think that's true. The left-wing culture of British intellectual life and the British left has been hostile to Britishness, and I think there's some good basis to that. I think the empire does deserve some criticism, and Britishness was for a long time kind of wedded to the empire. So I think there's some real basis to that. But it was actually studying the criminal law, New Labour's criminal law, that alerted me to the fact that there was a problem with the British nation. That and it was I wrote a book. It's an academic book. You wouldn't want to read it, called The Insecurity State. But it was about the criminal laws that New Labour brought in, which were very expansive, and he was notorious for expanding the scope of the criminal law. And as I studied that, one of the things that struck me is that when you dig into it, you see that all of these laws, these expansive powers of coercion that the criminal law is, were really premised on the idea that people don't the state lacks authority, and so we have this authoritative form of coercion, the criminal law. Don't do this or we'll punish you. But when you dig into it, the premise, the assumption is actually that the law lacks authority. Now, that's too long a story to go into, but in the course of studying it, a lot of these laws you'll remember that the war on terror was a thing, and so a lot of these laws were counter-terrorism laws, not entirely, but counter-terrorism was a big thing. And there was a well-known case back in the day from 2005 called the Belmarsh case, which was a case where foreign terrorist suspects who'd been detained without trial under a statute that was rushed through Parliament after 9/11. And these men had been detained without trial, and so they appealed their detention on the grounds that it was unlawful under Article 5 of the European Convention of Human Rights, which forbids detention without trial. And they, in the course of this, but the government had got around this problem by doing something that the European Convention allows you to do, which is to derogate if there's an emergency. So the government said, look, there's an emergency, there's a threat to the life of the nation, and this allows us to disapply Article 5 of the Convention, according to the Convention's own Article 15. It's got a kind of emergency provision. In an emergency, you can disapply. So the men who had been detained challenged this, and it went to the House of Lords, as it then was, before the Supreme Court, the highest court. And the judgment was very revealing about the way that state officials think about the nation. So the majority of the judges, the Attorney General said, look, Al-Qaeda represents a threat to the life of the nation because it blows people up and it, atrocities. And so that's why we have to put these people away, and we have an emergency and we have to disapply the convention. And the majority of the judges, all but one, agreed with that. They didn't agree. They said, look, it's not a decision for us. Whether or not there's a threat to the state that's so serious is a question for the executive. And this is a classic piece of constitutional doctrine. That's an executive question. It's within their competence. It's not for judges to make that decision. So they deferred to the executive. And that's a normal way of doing it. But one judge, Lord Hoffman, dissented, and he said, look, this can't possibly be right. It can't possibly be true that that Al-Qaeda represents a threat to the life of the nation. And the way he put it was like this, I'll quote him: the life of the nation is not coterminous with the lives of its people. The nation, its institutions and values endure through generations. And he then waxed patriotic about May 1940 and Dunkirk and the Armada and so on, and indeed was mocked much by legal academia for doing that. But his important point was that he doubted that therefore the threat of mere atrocities, that Al-Qaeda could blow people up, was a threat to the life of the nation, because the life of the nation is more than the lives of its nationals. And he said, there may be some nations too fragile or fissiparous to withstand a serious act of violence.
Wait.
Yeah.
What's that word?
Fissiparous, isn't it a great word? Fissiparous.
No idea what it means.
What does
It
that
sounds
mean?
good.
It means, I'm not sure myself, actually. I think it means tending to break up.
Okay.
It's just another way of saying fragile.
Okay.
Liable to fracture.
Okay.
So there may be some nations too fragile or fissiparous to withstand a serious act of violence, but that is not the case in the United Kingdom. So he said it can't possibly be the case that the British nation is so weak that one act of one atrocity by Al-Qaeda would be a threat to the life of the nation. And he says, he contrasts it with the Luftwaffe in 1940. He says, yeah, that was a threat to the life of the nation, or indeed the Provisional IRA. He says the Provisional IRA were trying to break up the territorial integrity of the United Kingdom, and they were killing the British military and bombing the British government in order to do it. That's a threat to the life of the nation. But merely blowing up, what Al-Qaeda do is terrible, but it's not a threat to the life of the nation, because the nation is these institutions that endure. The thing that hit me about this judgment was that he was the only one who said it. And the majority of the judges agreed with him. Didn't agree with him. They thought the nation was too fragile, implicitly. Parliament thought the nation was too fragile. That's why they passed the law allowing the government to detain men without trial. And the government thought so. The Attorney General who brought who opposed the men's application in the courts, he thought so too. So apart from Lord Hoffman, the whole official pinnacle of the state thought that there was a threat to the life of the nation if Al-Qaeda committed atrocities, say like the Manchester Arena.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that was Al-Qaeda, but that sort of thing was what people were worrying about. Now you can say, well, this is all a bit technical and legal, but it just shows the underlying assumption that in the minds of our state officials, the nation isn't any more than the vulnerable lives of its people. It's just the vulnerability of its people. And there isn't anything more to the nation than that. It is so fragile. So the institutional coherence, the longevity had disappeared. And it took me a while, because it was just buried in an interpretation of a legal judgment. I thought, that's interesting. A nation no more. That's interesting. But I didn't do much more with it. Where it really hit me was when lockdown was passed through Parliament. Then you really saw what that meant, which was that Parliament dissolved itself, said and fled in the face of this virus. When all through a real emergency, a real threat to the life of the nation in 1940, 1941, Parliament sat while the bombs rained down. And that dissolution of, as I say, skin in the national game, even our MPs thought, well, the best thing to do is us will go and cower at home and be safe not from foreign bombers, but from a virus, which, when it comes down to it, didn't kill that many people. It was I don't want to underplay it. It was a serious health problem. But it was that willingness to run away, to not treat their own role as the representatives of the nation as crucial at a moment like that, to suspend civil liberties and not to want to stay and hold the government to account while that was done. It just shows you the way in which they just don't take Parliament, we can dissolve it because we're not essential. They just don't. Nobody in our state takes the idea of the institutional coherence of the nation seriously. It's just not there. And so it was through thinking about criminal law that I kind of stumbled on this, and that's why that's what alerted me a few years later to Brexit. To why it was so crucial.
Let us just come in. I think we both have questions. Go on,
Sebastian. We're both like sitting on the edge of our seat, like yeah. So I'm aware that some people might think this sounds really academic, and they're saying, well, come on, I'm worried about my energy bills, I'm worried about doctor's appointments and schools, sure. And this guy's talking about the nation. Why is this important?
Because the reason you're worried about your energy bills, I mean, this is a political point, I think, but I would say the reason that you're worrying about your energy bills, or you're worrying that your kids can't afford anywhere to live, is because this same ruling caste, political class, whatever we want to call them, who've run Britain for the past 30 years, has not taken the whole of the nation as a whole, the idea that we are a singular people who live within a particular territory, who govern ourselves. They've not taken that idea very seriously. They've not regarded themselves as owing a duty to the idea that we are a singular people, and that therefore we owe each other some minimal solidarity. It should be, I think it is to some extent, a matter of national shame that we cannot house our young people.
Yeah.
We should be utterly ashamed of that. And I think lots of people are, rightly. Yep. And that's a result of the fact that we have elected, and that's down to us, we have elected politicians who prefer to grandstand in international chambers in Brussels or New York or Geneva or wherever it is, who prefer to, they think it's what they do. Starmer said it, didn't he? He was asked by Emily Maitlis, is it Westminster or Davos? And he said Davos, or notoriously, an example we use in the Taking Control book, when Boris Johnson had a meeting in Doncaster with Red Wall Tory MPs, and he ducked it by going to Kiev to talk to Zelensky. That really sums up where they think what matters is them walking tall in international global forums with their peers, with other ministers and diplomats and big name jet set academics, whoever it might be, policymakers. That's what's important to them. Meeting Red Wall MPs in Doncaster, and it's that inattention. We have a globalized, cosmopolitan ruling caste who don't take the problems. We're not building houses. And they say, yeah, we got, look, for 20 years, for 30 years, they've been saying we need to build more houses, but the houses don't get built.
Yeah.
Because they don't take and that housing's a good example, is a national problem. We have a real national problem about how we get the houses built, because we have a planning system that's constructed around local objections. And so it's very difficult to get through that, because there's constant local objection to any development. What we need is whole new towns. How are you going to build whole new towns? That's you've got to have some national perspective in order to do that. And our political class and our elite is incapable of that.
Why is it that because I think I agree with your analysis that it's the elite that have lost their faith in the nation. But it feels to me that some of the kind of popular politics we have now indicates that actually ordinary working people do still have some kind of belief in solidarity and community in the nation. And yeah, people would say things like the fish rots from the head down, won't they? So why has that spirit been retained amongst ordinary workers when it's not amongst the elite?
Yes, not just British workers, but also the the provincial middle classes, and small business owners, and businesses that don't do a lot of international trade. Most businesses don't export much. So it's that whole world. It's the metropolitan middle classes and the true national elite, which is globalized and cosmopolitan. I think the reason that the a large mass of the population is still committed to the nation is because two things. One, through all the years in the European Union that we were in the European Union, it's important to remember that the European Union didn't actually operate. Most of the money that was spent and most of the governmental activity was still done by the member states. It might have been organized through the European Union's laws and its meetings and all the rest of it, but the actual fiscal transfers and all of the money that moved around was all done by the member states, and the EU laws were all enforced by member state judges and member state regulators and so underneath it was the nation was just there doing all the work. So it's important to understand that the European Union is not, and this is one of the arguments we make in the book, is not a super state that's external to its member states. It was the way in which the member states ran themselves through these international forums, and we could think of them as nation states in denial of their national character. That the state part of the nation was in denial of the national character. So that's the first part of the answer.
And this is where you say that both sides kind of got that wrong in the referendum debate.
I think Eurosceptics made the mistake of thinking that it was a foreign thing. That it was just a purely foreign. It was the Brussels bureaucrats who were doing us down, and it was this foreign nanny state. When in fact it was the way in which the British, and we saw after 2016, after the referendum, it was the British elite who were they were more hostile to Brexit than the Europeans were. I mean, the Europeans didn't like it, but their major ally in making it difficult was the British liberal elite. So that's part of the answer. Just at one level, the nation just remains there. It's the nation state that's there. It's just in the imaginations of the people who actually operate it want to get rid of the nation part. Then the second part is that ordinary people, the only place where you can influence what government does is at the national level. You cannot influence. The European Union was designed to prevent popular influence on government. That's why it exists. You can't influence government at the level of the United Nations. You can't influence decisions at the level of NATO. All of these international organizations are designed to remove policymaking from direct accountability. You elect your government and the government then sends people to these organizations, but you're one step removed. The only place we can really influence government policy is at the level of the nation state. And that's why voters who are not in, if I really wanted to, I could toe the line as an academic at London School of Economics, and I could go to all of these forums and hang out in all these international things, and that would give me influence. I would have some, not major, but I could have some influence on policy. Whereas if you're just an ordinary voter outside those circles, the only way you can influence policy is through the national political process, and that's why most people rightly and sensibly and rationally have a commitment to the nation. It's the one point at which because the nation is itself a structure of self-government. It is the place at which the people are able to govern ourselves.
So can I just push you a little bit on that? So, and going back to my question of why do ordinary people still believe in the nation? And you say it's because they see that it's through that mechanism that they can have influence. But we've been out on the doorstep, haven't we, in a Runcorn by-election, And that's not what people say on the doorstep. On the
Okay.
doorstep, people say, whoever I vote for, we get the uni party. I can't do anything to change things. I'm never voting again. That's what they say to us a lot of the time. It's not that they don't want to vote this time.
You're all the same.
You're all the same, you
Yeah.
politicians. I'm never voting for anybody again.
Yeah. Well, and what happens then? I mean, there's two things I think that happen. There is truth to that. So that has been people's experience, and and there's no getting away from that. The problem we have to confront in terms of building a nation in Britain is that that's been the experience and where a lot of people are at. The second and equally serious aspect of that is that then I suspect, and I don't know, but the vibe that you get is that that people then think of the nation in ethnic terms. That's then people start to think in terms of, well, my identity as a British person is I'm not Pakistani, or I'm not a Muslim, or I'm not something else, or I'm not European. Now, that's really problematic if we want to build a self-governing nation. People think of it culturally. And this is where, for all I'm relaxed about people wanting to celebrate national continuity of St. George's Day, I think that's good, and I completely agree with you. It's incredibly yeah, we all know he was Turkish. That's the liberal trolling is tedious and offensive, but I don't. Those cultural symbols are themselves extremely weak. They don't carry much capacity for us to govern ourselves, and that's a really serious problem. The British nation as a political unity, as a political community, Benedict Anderson calls the nation an imagined political community. It's something we have to imagine, because we'll never know everybody who lives in Britain personally. We have to imagine this, and we imagine it through the sovereignty of the state. That's how we imagine it. We imagine it because the Crown in Parliament is sovereign. It makes laws for all of us that we all have to obey. And when it does that, it makes us a single people subject to the same laws. And that's the cynicism and the cynicism about that, which people are expressing to you on the doorstep, they're all saying my vote doesn't make any difference, means that's the nation really disintegrating. That's the real disintegration of the nation, is right there. Oh, I'm never going to vote again, and you can see why they think that. And that's the real disintegration of the nation. It's a great achievement of Thatcherism that people have been entirely privatized. They've been driven back into their own little private world. They're just consumers. They have no political connection with each other, because the people who actually ran the representative institutions, Parliament, the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, the Liberal Democrats, the SNP, were ultimately anti the British nation. I think we can say that. The Tories like to wave the flag, but their policies actually have destroyed the British nation as a political community. So that, I think that's a real disintegration.
You might have to unpick that for us a bit. So I think you've suddenly thrown Thatcher in there, whereas before I thought you were blaming Tony Blair. So can you maybe just spell that out a little bit? What did Thatcher break? What did Blair break? What did Brown break? If you could.
Thatcher herself was asked some years after she had fallen from power what she thought was her greatest achievement, and she said, well, New Labour is my greatest achievement, and she meant that she had neutered British socialism, as was the old British socialism, the Labour Party, as it old Labour, and had triumphed in her famous doctrine, there is no alternative to the market, that had triumphed, and Tony Blair was the embodiment of that triumph. What that did, and here I really recommend David Edgerton's Rise and Fall of the British Nation. So if anyone wants to read a really good book about this, David Edgerton's The Rise and Fall of the British Nation, which we rely heavily on in our book, because he shows the way in which, amongst other things, he shows the way in which the British nation proper really only had a fairly short period of existence since the Second World War. It was created out of the Second World War. Before that, Britain was a nation, but it was an imperial nation. It thought of itself as an empire. and certainly its rulers thought first as an empire. And what Thatcher destroyed was that post-war British nation. She stripped out the idea of that all the major social interests should be represented in government. And there is no alternative to the market. The market rules. And we've seen that. And public services have been privatized, and infrastructure, real wages have stagnated, and shareholder value has been the thing. Houses haven't been built. Infrastructure has decayed, which is what will happen when you just say, well, whatever the market says is what must be. And what she thought she was doing was reviving the great entrepreneurial British spirit of the Victorian era. Yeah? And so it would be good for Britain because it would, when I get rid of the terrible, suffocating, bureaucratic, regulating socialist British state, then this vibrant entrepreneurial nation will burst forth, as it was. And of course, that isn't what happened at all. It was foreign capital primarily that benefited, and/or British capital became globalized. It became an entrepot of global finance in the City of London, and so its interests then became global interests, not British interests. But we know directly that our infrastructure has been sold off sometimes to foreign governments.
Yeah.
That was so at the level of political economy, and this is where the Edgerton's very good. Even at the level of the political economy, the British nation was demolished. There is no national economy. I mean, that's he slightly maybe overstating it, but essentially there isn't a national economy. We've just seen this. It's the steelworks. There's only one place where we still make steel, and that the government had to rush in last week to before a Chinese company closed it down. So even at that level, at the level of the most basic infrastructural goods, the national economy has been entirely depleted by the Thatcherite ideology that ruled under Blair, as well as Thatcher and Major and Cameron.
So I know you have a question, Sebastian, in terms of
that?
Where do we go from here?
Yes, exactly. So
feels like we've got to that stage of the conversation.
Yeah, and when you gave that talk a couple of years ago, I came to listen to. I was amazed by how you talked, and this I think is unusual, from people that are generally critical of this sort of, let's say, global elite. Is that you talked about the fact that we can't go back. We can't just be nostalgic for the past. We have to have a vision going forward. So that's my question. Where do we go from here?
Okay, so we I know that one of the things that led to us talking about doing this pod was the idea of a Great Repeal Act.
Yeah.
That Rupert Lowe and Robert Jenrick and others have put about. And the idea is that if we could repeal, and again, it's underlying it is the Thatcherite idea. We only have to repeal a load of bad stuff that we've got, and then the British nation will burst forth again. And a lot of that, I think, is true. We do have to. Sorry, the repeal part's true. There's a lot of things we should repeal. We should repeal the Human Rights Act. We should end. All those, and the quangos, all the ways in which law gets made without reference to Parliament. Yeah. We should definitely be getting rid of, and we should also be getting rid of the laws that restrict people's civil liberty, particularly their freedom of speech, of which there's many, and New Labour does bear a lot of responsibility for those. So I agree with that part of it. The problem is that in itself, that's not going to do the job. Because again, they imagine that somehow this will, in the words of Lowe and Jenrick, this will restore the British nation. Like there's this thing there to just restore once you take the lid off. So my way of thinking about it is that they are right that that the sovereignty of Parliament is the central institution. The one thing that we inherit, not the one thing, but one of the things, the most important thing that we inherit from the old British nation and is still there, and Brexit proved that it's still there, is the sovereignty of Parliament. And the reason that the sovereignty of Parliament is so crucial is because it's the means by which we can rule ourselves, that we decide who sits there. We can decide how we should govern ourselves. Now, the problem, as you just noted, is that people are extremely cynical about Parliament, and understandably so. So that so I would say it's not just a matter of repealing. We need to reform the constitutional system, not entirely necessarily, but we need to get rid of the House of Lords. It's completely corrupt in the political sense, in the sense that failed politicians get booted up, they fail upwards into the House of Lords. So and they do, and you were discussing this with Baroness Fox recently, then the House of Lords, these failed politicians and the great and the good who are unelected, do all the actual serious work of legislative scrutiny, while the elected officials, the elected MPs, just grandstand and virtue signal. And we've got to bring that to an end by forcing the serious work back on our elected officials. So we need to get rid of the House of Lords. And we need proportional representation. We need to have, we now have effectively 5 or 6 parties, but we still have a system that gives one party a huge majority on 20% of the electorate. So we need proportional representation. However, proportional representation on its own, I don't think, is enough. The critics of PR are right; they have a point. You don't, when you vote in a PR system, you don't know exactly what you're voting for. You know the party you're voting for, but because you're not likely to have a party with a huge majority, as you are in first past the post, you don't know which government you're voting for, because the government is going to be cooked up after the election. So that's a real problem, and we see that in European systems which do have PR. We need to but there are ways around that, and I think the chief ways are twofold. One is to reform the party funding system. I think we just got to get rid of all corporate funding of political parties. We should make it illegal, and there should be a statutory cap on the maximum individual funding. That would force the political parties back to their voters and to their members, to be dependent on them, and to try to influence and really seriously inspire people to be willing to give up their money. And then the second thing is either shorter parliaments, much shorter parliaments, so that MPs are more immediately accountable, or recall on political grounds. That's complicated if you have a PR system, but means by which party members and electors can put more immediate pressure on their MPs. And I think with those two things, then the downsides of PR would be mitigated, and we could begin to break the cynicism that the population have. Now, of course, the obvious problem with that is the chicken and egg problem. Obviously, the existing parties that benefit from first past the post aren't going to vote for this. But there, I think there's an opportunity. This is partly why the blog is inspired by the Chartists, because the Chartists had this 6-point program, and they were the world's first mass movement for democracy, for universal suffrage, and in England or Britain, obviously many Irish people involved as well, but in Britain, and they had this 6-point program, and I think we need a chart, I don't know if we call it a charter, but we need something that appeals to people using PR, the idea of ending of corporate funding, recall, abolishing the House of Lords, a short charter of constitutional changes that would make an immediate difference and would allow people to get the sense that they would be really represented in Parliament. And that could be a thing that lots of parties that don't agree on policy necessarily, or what we should do with our sovereignty, would nevertheless agree on, because it was in their interest. And also it would possibly be an inspirational movement for people who weren't necessarily loyal to any particular party. So it would be a way of drawing people back into politics, into the state, and trying to counter that cynicism. That would be one part of my solution.
Can I ask two quick questions, and then maybe go on to the other part? A very quick question is just whether you would also get rid of the devolved parliaments. Perhaps a more involved question is, a lot of what you're saying seems to me to key into this other worry that I have about, some of the kind of popular political discussion. So, for example, people say, we just need to stop immigration. And if we stop immigration, everything will be okay. And I don't think that's right. I think just stopping immigration doesn't do anything about the millions of people who are massively unconnected from us already. And we've got to... I don't think you can build the kind of movement that you're talking about that might demand political change without that movement having some kind of principles that people can buy into. And how do we create those principles that people can buy into? I just wonder whether you're putting the cart before the horse, whichever way around it is, because it feels like you're saying we build a political movement to change the parliament, but you've got to have a reason to want to do that.
Right. No, so that is my second.
Okay. Oh, that's good.
You preempted him.
The second point, which is we need to start thinking we need to start constructing political ideas, and the SDP is in this territory, I know, around the idea of the national interest. That's where it's the national interest. The national interest is not you can't go and find in a library somewhere the book which tells you what the national interest is. It's not written down. It's not a given thing. And in the past, coming from a left background myself, we were all very cynical about the national interest. That's what you cook up when you want to push through some repressive policy. But the great thing about the national interest is precisely the argument over what it is, because then we're constructing our politics around the question of how we should live together, how we should live together as equal citizens on this piece of earth, not airy-fairy human rights, global schmobal, but we all live together on this island. How are we going to live here? And we can argue about that. We can have different versions of the national interest, but it's the national interest. It's not global priorities that we should construct our politics around. And so developing a politics of national interest is what we should do. Now, 2 points to that and to your question specifically. So part of that, I mean, there's lots to do. I mean, immediately energy, reshoring and building basic the basic industries and making sure we have strategic industries at home. There's widespread kind of tentative agreement around that. How you get there's another question. I think there are two. So you asked about devolution, and I do think that's a national interest question. I would get rid of it, but I wouldn't. The challenge is to convince Scottish and Welsh voters to get rid of it. That's the challenge. We can't just, do it from Westminster. That would be a disaster. But that will be to reverse Tony Blair's disintegration of the nation at that level. But the challenge is to offer to Scottish and Welsh voters a vision of Britain that they want in on, and I think that's perfectly possible. The experience of the SNP has been a disaster in Scotland, so the opportunity exists, but that should be an aim. An aim should be to reintegrate Britain. And that's that relates to your point about immigration, which is that I do think it's a problem, a very serious problem, tending to an emergency, that we are drawing in huge numbers of young men into who we simply cannot integrate. We don't know how to, and we don't have the capacity to, and that's a real problem that we do have to address. And so I understand why people want to stop immigration, and also we have a political economy model that relies on drawing in cheap labor. Instead, Hilary, you and I were at a meeting recently where you made the point that if you had one word of a solution, it would be productivity, productivity, productivity. And the cheap, low wage, cheap labor economy, which relies on immigrant labor, is the substitute for investment. And so I agree with that. So those are reasons to think that we have a really serious problem with immigration. However, and this goes to your point, if we can't integrate young men who come from Middle East or Africa or wherever into Britain, that's because we can't integrate ourselves already into Britain. That's the prior problem, that the nation is disintegrated independently of migration. It wasn't immigration that caused it. The problem is that mass immigration is coming into a state which is already politically disintegrated. It was disintegrated Scotland, England, Wales. It was disintegrated North and South. It was disintegrated Romania versus Brexit Britain.
London and not London. I'm going to
London
add
and
to
not
your
London,
list.
indeed.
Yeah.
So, the state is disintegrated in so many ways. There was a lot during the riots last summer. There's a lot of Russian bots, blah blah blah, all that stuff. People don't need Russian bots to tell them they're excluded from the state. If you live in those towns, it's obvious.
Yeah.
They know it, and so that's the prior problem. I mean, how we deal with the immigration problem is important, but if we try and deal with it without understanding that the prior problem is the disintegration of the nation internally, that it can't integrate its own existing indigenous population, then so we need a story that can inspire the existing indigenous population, and it's got to be a political story because that existing indigenous population already contains English, Welsh, and Scottish people, and it contains Jamaicans and West Indians and Sikhs and Hindus and Muslims who've been here for a very long time, for 50, 60 years, 3 generations. We need a story that integrates all of us already, leaving aside the new migrants who are coming. And then we might be able to integrate migrants. If we need migrant labour, we could integrate it. So that would be my answer.
Good. Is that more or less a good place to stop? I don't know. That feels like we've got the solution there. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, Peter dropped out, so I don't know if you were going to add anything else, Peter. But yeah, that was great.
We started on St. George's Day. One way to think about it would be: could we imagine, or could we should aim to that we could create new national holidays. That we could establish that the task, we should think not in terms of national restoration, because I think that's although there are things like the sovereignty of Parliament that we should definitely draw from the past because they're crucial to the effort to build a nation, but we should think in terms of our ambition should be that we could come up with living national holidays for this living nation, and that we can inspire a vision and a way of imagining ourselves, and productivity would be a big part of it. There were people who are oriented to that. There were people that's oriented to housing its own people. There were people that is oriented to understanding that we are a regional power and we're not a global player. It's a project of nation building, and because the old nation disintegrated, like it or not, and that's why we have all the problems that we have.
Yeah. My Women's Rights Network group are threatening to reclaim St. George's Day to celebrate yesterday's Supreme Court decision. So anyway, that probably takes us to Culture Club. So I know we'll just give you a little small rest, Pete, if that's all right, because I know you want to talk a bit about regional music, but let me just say just a few words about St. George's Day as we are celebrating it in this episode. So I don't know if this happened when you were young, Sebastian, but when I was young, on St. George's Day, everybody would go to school in their brownie or their guide or their scout uniforms, or if they were in the Sea Cadets, or nothing like that.
Not that I remember, no.
I do.
You do, yeah.
The Boy Scouts, we used to do, you've reminded me, I think we used to do some church thing on St. George's Day, if I recall.
Okay, yeah, we used to have a special assembly and sing some patriotic songs in assembly. There wasn't actually that much flag flying from my memory. So at the St. George's Cross, which we obviously have on the set today, I don't remember that being a big part of it, but St. George was definitely a big part of it. And nobody felt uncomfortable with celebrating the English National Day in the way that perhaps they would do now. Interestingly, we have in my local park a St. George's Day parade. It's actually on the 29th, around the 23rd. But all the brownies and the guides and the scouts and everybody are all coming out for our parade. We have had the bandstand repainted by the Rotary Club. Thank you to the Rotary Club. They've repainted the bandstand in blue and gold. And we are doing special sweeping sessions to clear the park of leaves. So it's a tidier park for them to march in. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Great. Well, I haven't got anything planned for St. George's Day, but this is kind of my St. George's Day celebration. Because it'll go out, so people will be listening to this.
They will. So
23rd.
Cheers then.
Yes.
Cheers.
I've got that thing in there. But...
Sorry, I've only got this.
Cheers. So, Pete, you wanted to talk about regional music, didn't you? And I think this hopefully redresses the balance a bit towards our devolved nations, as well as talking about England today.
Well, I'm glad that St. George, in a way, I'm glad that St. George's Day lives in your community. You know, that's
Yes.
although I've just distance myself from the idea that we could restore this old nation that's gone. I'm not averse to keeping aspects of indigenous culture alive. Far from it. I just don't think we can lay much on them politically, but culturally, why not? And I just was, my family all played traditional music, traditional Irish, Scottish music primarily, but English music as well. And the discovery that English traditional music was worth listening to was quite something. So I was just at a concert. The last concert I went to just a couple of days ago was by Ryan Young, who's Scotland's leading young fiddle player, and is completely reinventing how traditional Scottish rural music is played, and in a way that draws a lot on, without jazzifying it, kind of draws a lot on the way that jazz musicians think about music, and it's a complete reinvigoration. It's recognisably Scottish folk music, but it's completely reinvented, and from my mind, that's it's beautiful and exciting, and that's going on in England as well. In Manchester, there's a group of young, I think they're Manchester-based, Brown Wimpenny. They're on the wilder end, but they sing English folk songs and American Appalachian stuff, but in a completely extraordinary way. Or there's a group near me called the Owl-like Trio who've reinvented traditional music entirely. And if listeners are interested, the English group who are most extraordinary, they no longer play live. It's a group called Spiro. You can get them on Spotify. But they've taken English folk music, English folk tunes, and reinvented them through the lens of American minimalism, of Steve Reich and people like that, and but it's still recognisably it could only be English music, and that's the really extraordinary thing. So, and there's another Scottish group called Rant for Women Fiddlers, who I'd really recommend. It's a very vibrant, exciting scene in traditional music at the moment, and that's a part of an older Britain that's being taken forward by young people, and it's great to hear.
Yeah,
brilliant. Well, if you send us a couple of those recommendations, we'll put them in the show notes for this episode.
Sure, be glad to.
Great. So thanks, Pete. It's been a great ramble through the British countryside there. Whatever you do on St. George's Day, have a good day. Happy St. George's Day. And we will see you later in the week for a news episode.
Thanks for listening.